Tuesday, there'll be a crucial vote on a motion sponsored by the EFF in the National Assembly calling for the closure of the Israeli embassy in South Africa. It would also entail cutting all diplomatic ties with Tel Aviv. There have even been calls in some of the speeches by ANC MPs, including Supremo Mapelo, who chairs Parliament's International Relations Committee, of cutting economic ties with Israel. We heard last week from the SA Israeli Chamber of Commerce on what that would mean for the South African economy. Chris Landsberg is the chair of the African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy Center at the University of Johannesburg. While very openly, brazenly and publicly, the South African government, whether it be Cyril Ramaphosa, Naledi Pandor, or whether it be its MPs in Parliament, are very much keen in cutting diplomatic ties with Israel. I read in the Sunday Times that behind closed doors, there is still ongoing debate within cabinet about whether this would be the correct way forward, particularly if South Africa can play a meaningful role in mediation, negotiation between Palestinians and Israel in that part of the world. Chris, good morning.
Good morning, and I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised by that debate. It's interesting, Lester, isn't it, that the minister who's really been bold and courageous, at times even out on a limb, on her own, setting a very serious tone on punitive measures against Israel and the president, now find themselves in a debate. I'm not surprised, and I'll tell you why. Forget for a moment about whether it coincides with Corneille Mulder and the DA position. The reality is, if we go the route of cutting complete ties, I'll get in a moment to what the options are. But if we go the route of cutting complete ties, this notion that you've also now expressed and others expressed, that we'll be cutting ourselves out of the process, I think it's almost understated. It's such a serious reality, and this is why. Israel has such a control over the Palestinians, such a control. It never allowed for an airport to be built there. It never allowed for a port to be built there, barring a small port. But more relevant for this conversation, you get accreditation, like South Africa now has accreditation to Palestine, and Palestine has accreditation to us, to the Republic of South Africa. But that accreditation comes through Tel Aviv, to the Foreign Ministry of Israel. So if you cut ties with Israel, ironically, you're cutting ties with Palestine. I mean, I'm just stating that as a fact. That's not a political point I'm making. That's just the reality of how Palestine has, over the years, perfected its absolute dominance over Palestine. South Africa will therefore have absolutely no say, not just of the future, how this is ended. It will have to use third parties and friends in the region, and I don't think South Africa can conceive itself not playing a role in the future of Palestine.
Because that's very interesting. South Africa does have a representative in Ramallah through Sean Bielefeld, who is South Africa's representative and ambassador to the Palestinian envoy. So does that mean if South Africa cuts diplomatic relations with Israel, that essentially leaves Sean Bielefeld and the small diplomatic corps in Ramallah essentially stranded?
It's interesting what you've just. Well, I mean, I don't think it leaves them stranded at all. It's interesting what you've just said, isn't it? Isn't it fascinating that our minister goes to the bold step, and it had to be followed up with measures domestically. Otherwise, what's the point? We go to the step of recalling all our envoys, including the ambassador from Tel Aviv. And that was, of course, a sign that things would come. But let's just stick to that point. By doing that, South Africa was sending an extremely serious message to Israel about just how outraged it is with Israeli conduct. But we don't recall our envoy in Palestine, and in fact, the physical harm and danger is there. Now, let's just push the physical danger and harm aside, not that it's not important. It is again sending a message how we prioritize and how outraged the government is about what the UN called a carnage, a living hell playing itself out in Palestine. But I come back to the point. Now that we've recalled our envoys and ambassador from Tel Aviv, there was going to be action. We already called the ambassador in Pretoria for a démarche in which we expressed our distaste, our outrage, and that should be communicated to his government, which I'm sure he did. I suppose there are options, right? The next option, other than a démarche, is you can expel an ambassador from a country, especially if the differences are literally irreconcilable. And for now, it is. You can go further. You can declare an ambassador a persona non grata. Now, that's almost tantamount to cutting ties, but you're not closing the embassy. But I don't think the Jewish board and the Council of Chambers, I don't think it's just scaremongering and threats, even though there is an element of that saying that to South Africa. But I really want to make a point that I'm sure many listeners are surprised by. I'm sure they were not aware of the fact that any country who has representation in Ramallah gets accreditation from Tel Aviv. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu will respond with furiousness, and that government, by the way, I don't think he's going to survive this war, but whoever is the prime minister and the government will literally say, we don't want South Africa near any prospects of negotiation.
And that then leaves South Africa away from the process, whether it be in communication with Palestine or with Israel. Just very quickly, Chris, in October, the president says that the South African government still stands ready to mediate with South Africa's memory of a peaceful transition from apartheid to democracy and a TRC process. Can we still be an honest broker if we cut diplomatic ties, particularly of bringing Palestinians and Israelis with our experience around the table? Are we still on a position to do that if we continue with this motion?
So let me answer you briefly, just to say that nothing prevents us from having ties with Palestine afterwards, but it will not be recognized in Palestine by the Israelis, right? So we'll be cut out there, but we can invite them to South Africa as many times as we wish, try to influence the process. I don't blame South Africa for having taken this stance. I think there is a genocide playing out there. And South Africa has referred Israel now to the ICC, and I hope, Lester, ironically, that settles another issue, namely this throwing and throwing. Are we going to leave the ICC? Are we not going to leave the ICC? Because of anger over Vladimir Putin. And so now that we refer the country, it seems to me we're there to stay in that organization.
Professor Chris Landsberg, really appreciate your time. Chair of the African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy Center at the University of Johannesburg. Thanks so much for joining us.